Good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to episode 6 of the KMG Show. Just let me mute the playthrough here, and we're going to start with Canada again. I know this annoys a lot of people, but as I said yesterday, my country is literally coming apart in real time, and I think I don't know, I'll keep this early focus on Canada up for a little while longer. But all indications is that the elite is going to attempt to just pretend really that nothing happened and that it's time to move on. Let's see. First story up. Transport Minister confirms police will be moving in on new blockades. Transport Minister Marc Garneau says provincial police will be moving in to respond to injunctions against new blockades sprouting up across Canada in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who opposed a planned natural gas pipeline in British Columbia. Speaking to reporters on Parliament Hill on Tuesday, Garneau said some of these new blockades have been temporarily stopping the trains. Yeah, well, that's one way to put it. The provincial police will be moving in and responding to the injunctions that have been put in. This is curious, because we were told last week that Canada is a highly evolved country where politicians never tell the police what to do. And the Ontario Provincial Police, to give one example, is not under the jurisdiction of the federal government. But the planned police intervention comes just one day after the OPP moved in against a rail blockade that had been set up by Mohawks near Belleville, Ontario, and charged 10 protesters. While the first train ran through the newly cleared tracks in Tyendinaga Monday night, it remained the only train to pass through the area as of Tuesday afternoon. CN Rail would not comment on why the service has yet to fully resume. Following the Monday arrests, multiple solidarity protests and blockade emerged across Canada. Among those new protests were a blockade that halted a regional transit service near Hamilton and a rolling blockade set up by the Kanawake Mohawk on Quebec's Honoré Mercier Bridge. The Canadian Pacific Railway also obtained an injunction to stop a blockade in Kanawake, just south of Montreal. Meanwhile, in BC, protesters continue to blockade the Port of Vancouver and demonstrate at the BC legislature. At least 6 people have been arrested. This from Global News. Wet'suwet'en hereditary chief optimistic, ready to talk with RCMP on blockades. Chief Woos, one of the Wet'suwet'en hereditary leaders, says he is optimistic ahead of Tuesday evening talks with the RCMP on the force's withdrawal from land claimed by his community as their traditional territory as part of ongoing talks to end nationwide blockades. Now, I'll just explain. This is complicated and not entirely clear, even to me. But there is a band system of Indian government throughout Canada. There's about 700 of them. Most of them, I believe, a couple hundred members. And these bands are funded by the federal government, by Canadian taxpayers. The bands have elections. They elect their leaders. But there is a superstructure, if you will, of Indian government in this country. The hereditary chiefs, who are, as their name implies, a hereditary oligarchy, who are not subject to popular approval. So let's see. I feel optimistic, physically tired, but optimistic, said Woos, who is also known as Frank Alec. There's good faith and goodwill with the parties, especially the RCMP. For 3 weeks, protesters have intermittently blockaded railways, roads, buildings, and border crossings as part of what they have described as a show of solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, some of whom oppose the Coastal GasLink pipeline set to be built through their country. While other hereditary chiefs and all elected band councillors, including from the 20 other Indian bands along the proposed route, support the project, Woos and others remain opposed and have thanked protesters for showing their support. So you have an alliance between hereditary Indian chiefs and radical environmentalists. And I suppose those who really want to teach Western Canada a lesson, and we'll get to that shortly. This is from Canadian Press. Chanting Wet'suwet'en supporters defy injunction, return to the BC legislature. The BC legislature is, I don't know, about 2-3 miles away from where I live. About 300 people were gathered at the front steps, with many crowding at the building's ceremonial gates used by dignitaries, including the Lieutenant Governor and members of the royal family. Police were also on the steps standing next to the supporters, but there were no reports of arrest. "We are not here seeking arrest," said an Indigenous youth leader speaking with a megaphone. "We are here as our duty as Indigenous youth. Bring your blankets. It's going to be a long night." At about 7 p.m., the supporters blocked the progress of a police van that arrived at the legislature. They linked armed and chanted, "Peaceful and with love, unarmed and non-violent." Well, blockades are by their nature violent. It's use of physical force to prevent access. But I suppose violence in my country is in the eye of the beholder. The group placed a carved ceremonial mask on the ceremonial gates, saying it would look after them during their gathering. A fire they said was sacred was lit in a steel pit that was placed at the top of the legislature stairs. Indigenous youth leader Saul Brown told the protest their cause is worthy despite the court injunction. "We're asking you to stand with us shoulder to shoulder. You are on the right side of history." Now let's move to Eastern Canada. Intermodal executive hails Trudeau's badass, that's in quotation marks, end run around rail blockades. Reported deal to let Canadian National, that's a railway line, quietly route some freight around protests gets high marks from director of trucking company hit hard by the disruptions. Something strange happened over the weekend to Transport D-Square in Montreal. The intermodal carrier got notice that rail containers from Western Canada tied up indefinitely from weeks of protest blockades were en route. "We were shocked," said Director Corey Darbison. The explanation could lie in a report from the CBC today that Prime Minister Trudeau's government brokered a deal to let CN use rival Canadian Pacific's network to route some freight around protest blockades, including via the United States. The CBC said the arrangement allowed for deliveries of essential goods, including propane, to communities otherwise cut off by the blockades. Neither rail carrier would confirm the agreement, which apparently occurred as the Trudeau government worked to diffuse Indigenous-led protests connected to the route of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. While people kicked and screamed, Trudeau and the team did a badass job, Darbison said. You know, I suppose it's only a matter of time until these alternate routes are discovered by protesters and blocked as well. But I suppose we'll take the good news wherever we can find it. Now, as I've explained previously on, I suppose, this live stream and others, Canada doesn't have free speech. It is supposedly guaranteed under our satirically named Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but our Supreme Court has ruled that truth is not a defense to hate speech, and there are many provincial jurisdictions where, say Saskatchewan, where quoting the Bible can get you in serious trouble, can lead to judgments against you. Canada has a House of Commons and it has a Senate, which is roughly equivalent to Britain's House of Lords. And the senators serve, they're not elected, they serve until the age of 75. They are supposedly the chamber of sober second thought, which I suppose is one of the most popular and tiresome Canadian political cliches, because the senators are political hacks who are appointed as a reward for service to the ruling class. But there's a senator in Canada called Lynn Beyak who decided that she was going to use her office to let Canadians express their differing views on what's called reconciliation, with the result that she was suspended from the Senate and ordered to attend a re-education class. I'm not exaggerating. This is not hyperbole. A Canadian senator was ordered to attend a re-education class. Apparently, she left the class without getting her diploma, and then she was threatened with suspension once more, and now she has issued a groveling apology. According to the Canadian press, she has sought to stave off suspension from the upper chamber, pledging to do more to make amends for the harm she caused by posting offensive letters online. I would like to unreservedly apologize for my actions, she said. After deep and careful reflection, I've come to the view that the posting of offensive and hurtful letters to a Senate public website was wrong and ill-considered, and my insistence on leaving them up was also wrong. The letters were sent to Bayak, a senator from Ontario, in support of her defense of the residential school system, while the Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded the system caused horrific abuse and alienation for generations of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. Bayak has suggested there were benefits to the program that have been overshadowed. When I worked for a magazine called Alberta Report, we got in someone to write a piece because it was so controversial, attempting to give voice to those Indians, Métis, and Inuit who had attended residential schools and had some positive things to say about it. This led to a complaint before the Alberta Human Rights Commission, and it is pretty much against the law to not follow the party line on this question. As the controversy grew, she defended her decision to make and keep the letters public. She said they weren't racist and removing them would be an affront to free speech. While my intent was never to hurt anyone, I see now that my actions did not have their desired effect, which was to promote open and constructive dialogue. Regretfully, my actions were unhelpful to the national conversation on this issue. And so we see that in Canada, what we get from our politicians are statements that one associates with Stalinist Russia or Maoist China. But I suppose that is the price one pays for being arguably the most progressive or woke country on earth. Bayak's refusal to take down the letters got her kicked out of the Conservative caucus. Yes, whatever you heard, the Conservatives in my country talk about their commitment to free speech. They are lying to you. They temporarily suspended her from the Senate. To end her suspension, she was to fully apologize and complete education programs on racism. But her suspension automatically ended when Parliament dissolved for the 2019 federal election. She said that she felt that she'd fulfilled the requirements, but last month the Senate Ethics Committee concluded she'd not gone far enough. The committee said the apology she offered at the time was insufficient and she did not fully finish the education program. The senators on the committee recommended her suspension be reinstated. Now, there has always been means for senators to take care of their members who are, guilty of crimes, guilty of, being on the take, that sort of thing, or not showing up for duty. But there's hardly any point in having a Senate when everyone is forced to say the same things, and they will be suspended, and or kicked out if they don't. But again, such as Canada 2020. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the bigger picture here, which is the elite must come up with some sort of justification for the turmoil that Canada has been put through. And that there are two justifications. The first one is that Canada is not a legal country. It's never been a legal country. It's been a wicked, illegal country from its inception as a dominion in 1867. And the second argument is that the resource industry is over. It's finished. It's done. It's the current year, Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia will have to leave their petrochemical resources in the ground. They'll just have to suck it up because, again, it's the current year. Aaron Wary has a piece on CBC News. CBC News is, they do have opinion pieces, but increasingly they're so-called news reports are just opinion pieces, barely in the guise of news. This is some high-flown talk here from Mr. Wary. Here's an example. These are trying moments for the country and its leader, but it might also be harder these days to find a path through the tumult. On its own merits, Tech Frontier probably didn't deserve to be framed as a litmus test of anything. On the other hand, its economic viability was in serious doubt. On the other, its emissions weren't necessarily going to be decisive in Canada's pursuit of its international climate targets. But its loudest proponents and opponents framed it as a referendum on the future of either the oil sector or the climate. If more had been done over the last 30 years to settle the climate questions, now casting a pall over the next 30 years, if Canada had a clear route to net zero emissions and a better understanding of how the oil and gas industry would fit into that world, Tech Frontier wouldn't have had to carry so much symbolic weight. Given the crosses the project was being asked to bear, maybe it's not surprising that its investors decided to walk away. It's also possible that if the project had a real chance of ever turning a profit, Tech's resource directors would have stuck it out. See, this is part of the new line that this project was always a bust, never going to make money, just an enormous $21 billion boondoggle that the company, for some reason, wasted 10 years seeking regulatory approval from, and we're all better off that it is not happening, because we got to get to zero emissions in 2050, which is 30 years from now. It is never going to happen, and it doesn't make any difference, certainly not to Canada. Higher temperatures are good for Canada in all sorts of ways. But, it's time to get into the whole spirit of reconciliation, every kind of reconciliation, because that's the future. Now, we have a piece by Scott Gilmore in Maclean's, which is called The Real Betrayal of Albertans, Life for Politicians Who Won't Tell Them the Truth. Every major player and investor understands the days of oil are numbered. Politicians are the only ones too shameless to say it out loud. Scott Gilmore is considered a conservative in my country, which is absolutely hilarious because, of course, he is nothing but, even by the, how would you say, the standards of conservatism. He's an international activist involved with the World Bank and the United Nations, Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. And most interestingly enough, he is married to Catherine McKenna, the Minister of Infrastructure and Liberal MP for Ottawa Centre. Until recently, Catherine McKenna was the Minister of the Environment, and I suppose she became rather world famous, not least because she is a beautiful woman, and I don't say that sort of thing lightly. She really is a gorgeous woman. And I suppose because of this, she was mocked by some Canadians, some cruel, wicked Canadians, as climate Barbie. So Gilmore writes, I dislike career politicians as a species. Until this week, I couldn't explain to myself precisely why. All I knew was that if someone had spent most, if not all, their adult life in politics, there is an almost certain chance they make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Okay. I disentangled this personal puzzle as the tech resources issue percolated in the news over the last week. After Alberta Premier Jason Kenney and the outgoing federal Conservative Party leader Andrew Scheer had made the tech resources mine application a casus belli, a cause of war. They warned if Ottawa did not support the project, it would be a cataclysmic betrayal of Albertans, unleashing a future of economic misery for the province. Luckily, the federal Liberals, terrified of alienating the majority of Canadians who are increasingly worried about climate change and equally terrified of alienating Albertans who are increasingly worried about jobs, they never had to take that decision. Good news for the Liberals, eh? The Liberals do not hold a single seat in the provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. They do not give a toss for Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta has been a whipping boy for the federal Liberal Party for decades. Western Canada as a whole has been a whipping boy for the federal Liberal Party. They don't care. Gilmore explains that he grew up in Alberta and worked in a refinery to pay for university. So he's especially sympathetic to the pain, worry, and anger of Albertans as their economy continues to sputter. But you will note that Gilmore does not live in Alberta anymore. He is relocated to non-redneck place. There's Alberta, I should explain, a lot of Albertans suffer from a really terrible inferiority complex. They know that they and Saskatchewan and BC pay the freight for Canada, but they're very sensitive to accusations that they are rednecks, that they are mouth breathers, knuckle draggers, they marry their cousins or whatever. And for decades, we've seen Albertans attempt to, demonstrate to the rest of Canada that they're really not such bad fellows. But here we get to the money graph. Kenny, Shear, Teck, every major energy company that is not already in the oil stands, Bay Street, Wall Street, and the banking and insurance industries all know that the days of oil are all but over. I wonder what he means by that, all but over. Like 100 years? 50 years, 30 years. That's still a fair number of years. But the politicians are the only ones too frightened or too shameless to say it out loud. What are we going to replace oil and gas with? Windmills? Solar panels? Really? Oh, maybe we'll switch to electricity. But of course, electricity doesn't involve any environmental degradation at all, actually, unless it comes from hydroelectric power. It very much does. But, everyone can drive their Teslas and feel that they're helping the environment. There is no doubt that a concern about Canada's regulatory process was the straw that broke the Teck's camel's back. Yeah, that's one way of putting it, Scott. Yeah, the global price of oil is well below the point that would make the frontier mine profitable. Yes, the emerging global consensus is that if we don't address climate change now, the very existence of the human race is at stake. I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail coming up, because it is utter rubbish. Utter rubbish. Gilmore continues, this is not a claim being made by Greta Thunberg or a wild-eyed Extinction Rebellion activist. That comes directly from the multinational investment bank, JP Morgan. Ooh, multinational investment bank. Well, that sounds good. Never mind that JP Morgan walked away from this report, and that JP Morgan Chase is essentially a criminal operation, but a report which they, as I say, distanced themselves some years ago, said we cannot rule out catastrophic outcomes where human life as we know it is threatened. When exactly are the seas going to start to boil anyway? When is the Earth going to turn into Venus? Investors are not just avoiding Alberta's oil sands, they don't want to put money into oil anywhere, period. Really, I guess that's why ExxonMobil and all these companies are in the process of shutting down. The world still runs on oil, and the world will continue to run on oil and gas and coal for quite some time. If we're talking about people lying, Scott Gilmore is the person who is lying. And as I say, the message here is Scott Gilmore, or rather the Canadian lead to Alberta, drop dead. Very quickly, my Canada roundup, just give you an idea of just what a joke my country has become. Here's two stories from the same day, and they're about Canada's military. And Canadian military stories are pretty much always the same. That the government announces that X billions of dollars or tens of billions of dollars are committed to buy some weapon systems, and that never happens. Or Canada decides that instead of getting new nuclear submarines, it's going to buy some used diesel ones they bought for. Not one is seaworthy. From the Canadian press, Canada's long-running effort to buy new fighter jets is facing another delay. The federal government announced Tuesday it's giving jet makers another 3 months to submit their proposals for replacing Canada's aging CF-18s. Companies were to have submitted their bids at the end of March, but now they have until June. The move is to ensure the government receives high-quality bids for the estimated $19 billion contract, according to the federal procurement minister. Canada is planning to buy 88 new fighters to replace the CF-18s, which are now nearly 40 years old. The planes that are in the running to replace the CF-18s, Lockheed Martin's F-35, Boeing Super Hornet, and Saab's Gripen. Canada has been working for nearly a decade to buy new fighter jets for the military. Stephen Harper's Conservative government promised in 2010 to purchase 65 F-35s before that plan was scuttled due to cost. The F-35s, just, you want to talk about a boondoggle? There you go. The Liberals promised in the 2015 election to immediately launch a competition to buy new fighter jets, but did not pull the trigger until last July. Well, you see, there's a reason for that, because when you're talking about spending $19 billion on equipment for the Canadian military, that means that other things will have to be cut. And since our military has been a non-starter for decades now, it's not going to happen. It's simply not going to happen. Here is an even more amusing and or infuriating story. The federal government has spent slightly more than $1 billion over the last 7 years on design on preparatory contracts for the Navy's new frigates and supply ships, and the projects still haven't bought anything that floats. Now, I should remind listeners that $1 billion is pocket change. Well, it's pocket lint in the United States. It's actually a significant amount of money in my country. The figures tabled recently in Parliament represent the first comprehensive snapshot of what has thus been spent thus far on the frequently delayed project to build replacement warships. It's an enormous amount of money for two programs that have been operating for more than a decade with little to show for their efforts to date. It will be years before the Canadian Surface Combatant Project, which aims to replace the Navy's frontline frigates with 15 state-of-the-art vessels, and the Joint Support Ship Program for 2 replenishment vessels actually deliver warships. The numbers and details for each advanced contract were produced in the House of Commons in response to written questions from the Conservative opposition. The money was divided almost evenly between the federal government's 2 go-to shipyards, Irving Shipyard in Halifax and Seaspan of Vancouver, the builder of supply ships. The Irving family is one of the 2 families that the Canadian government exists largely to look after, the other one being the McCain family. And then we have companies like Power Corp and SNC Lavalin and Bombardier. Yeah, you think that the Canadian government works for the Canadian people? No, it does not. It works for a handful of oligarchs. So let's see, what is the chat saying? Need something better than cheap iPhone headset to record with. That's not me. Okay, I do not have a cheap microphone. Nuclear power or coal are the only other alternatives to oil and natural gas, but those aren't acceptable to the climate loons either. Nothing is acceptable, says Veronica Meadows, respecter, and she makes an excellent point. Now, there are 2 types of deep greens. There are the deep greens who will come out and say, yeah, we want a massive die-off. We want billions of people to die, and we want the state of the earth to be brought back, dialed back to, I don't know, 1900, 1800, 1700, 1300, or whatever. Whereas most of them understand that, yeah, that's not going to be very popular. It's going to be a hard sell, you know. A Walrus Libertarian says, why buy jets when you can fund hotel rooms for refugees? Well, yes, exactly. It's a question of priorities. And the military is not a priority for our governments, whether they be liberal or conservative. One reason being, as I never fail to point out, is that our military does not have a purpose. It simply does not have a purpose. There has not been a discussion of this issue during my lifetime. Canadian soldiers are sent off for peacekeeping missions. Ooh, Mali, as if anyone in this country cares about Mali, or as if Mali is in, it has anything to do with the Canadian interest. Oh, and occasionally the troops are used when it snows too much. Let's see. I think KMG is already outdrawing Luke on live view, says James Fountain. He says, I see that Cato Gottfried had Luke on this week. I hope they host Kevin on there too eventually. Well, I've had very friendly relations with Paul Gottfried over the years. This Cato fellow, yeah, someone, Chogokin 666, man, that Cato guy really dislikes Catholics. Well, that's the impression that I got from listening to some of his shows. Okay, so what else are going to be talking about on the show? Just okay, forget Canada. That bit is over now. We're going to talk about will coronavirus wreck globalism, and then Trump versus Kritarchy, and then Barr versus Silicon Valley. Red staters want out of blue states. United Kingdom equals the paid-off aisles. Cultural appropriation update. TikTok. Ooh, something for the kiddies. Total smoking ban looms, even in private. Tex Avery prophet, and is bisexuality real? Why would I bring that up? Because the hashtag bisexual men are real has been trending on Twitter. One wonders just how organic so many of these trending hashtags are. But apparently there's a group of men out there who are terribly upset that, I don't know, within the alphabet people community, they're not taken all that seriously. And that even people who have, demonstrated their pro-alphabet people bona fides are, I don't know, not all that enthusiastic about them. This reCAPTCHA. I'm sure everyone knows what reCAPTCHA is. I saved a URL of a story from Bloomberg related to coronavirus, and now I'm going to go to it, and it is making me select all the images with stairs. One of the things that they started to do with reCAPTCHA recently is to heavily grain them. So it becomes even, one is, peering, squinting at the screen to try and figure out what it is you're looking at. And here's the short version of my little adventure with reCAPTCHA there. It is not going to let me pull that Bloomberg story up again. And oh, here we go with Bloomberg again. Unusual activity. What would be the unusual activity, I wonder, that I went to a Bloomberg story, I followed a Twitter link to a Bloomberg story, and then I saved the link. I closed it because I had, I don't know, about 50 or 60 tabs open. And then I put them all in order to bring up. And apparently that constitutes unusual activity. So how bad is Corona Chan going to be? Is it going to be catastrophic? And one of the ways in which it could be catastrophic, well, would be to knock out the just-in-time supply system that seems to be, ongoing as we speak. Could it actually wreck globalism itself? Now, Vox Day, I suppose one could call him an extremist, but I think he may be ahead of the curve here. He writes today, Dear President Trump, the Emergency Committee of the World Health Organization declared on January 30th that the coronavirus outbreak meets the criteria for a public health emergency of international concern. As this is a global health emergency, it is undeniable that the national security interest of the American people leaves you no choice but to declare martial law in the United States. Please do so at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, the concerned citizens of the United States of America. P.S. If martial law helps you drain the swamp, build the wall, and restore the 1965 demographic balance of the population while you're at it, so be it. Now, I suppose since the 1970s in North America, The elite view, which they have not been shy about expressing, is that foreigners are good. In fact, the more foreign your life becomes, the better off you're going to be, the better off everyone is going to be. Xenophobia is pretty much a swear word now. Well, xenophobia is the natural condition of humanity. People are suspicious of foreigners, and to a very great extent, well, depending on the circumstances, they don't like foreigners too much. But we've been told that our natural instincts in this regard are not to be followed. The foreigners have so much to offer us, not least delicious food. I recall years ago living in Vancouver that a Mongolian restaurant opened up at Broadway and Cambie, which is a high volume intersection. And people that I worked with, oh, did you hear about the new Mongolian restaurant? And I suppose this was a liberal milieu I was involved with, so I think I kept my mouth shut. What I wanted to say is Mongolian food? I mean, what is it about the idea of Mongolian food that you would find so intriguing? What exactly would you expect to find at a Mongolian restaurant? Pressed yak and kumis? But no, and apparently the world economy is entirely dependent on foreigners because, of course, it would be ridiculous for us to make the stuff that we need. Now, I'm familiar with the argument that we're better off having the Chinese and the Vietnamese and the like make all the cheap tat that is bought in Walmart, but this coronavirus crisis suggests that maybe we are not better off doing so because it makes us hostage to the rest of the world in a way that we were not previously. That somebody sneezes in Wuhan and suddenly we're all in big trouble. Okay, now let's try that Bloomberg article one more time. Well, here we go. Peter Navarro says coronavirus shows U.S. offshored too much. This is the White House trade advisor, Peter Navarro. He says, not surprisingly, that the U.S. has offshored too much of its supply chain. He expressed confidence on Fox's Sunday morning feature, saying the American economy is exceedingly strong and not particularly vulnerable to what happens in China. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he, as in the famous words of Mandy Rice Davis, because, Trump had very optimistic things to say and still does. One would not expect Trump or Navarro to start screaming, it's time to panic. Come on. Get that food in, get those cans in, get that bottle watered in. I mean, even if things were heading in that direction, it wouldn't particularly be all that useful. Navarro emphasized his goal to bring more of the U.S. supply chain home. A lot of it is in China, some of it's in India, some in Europe, but we've got to get that back on shore. Navarro said he's dealing with the immediate issue of face masks, specifying request coming this week for N95 face masks, which he said China put export restrictions on. Well, yeah, this takes us to the just-in-time supply system, that there is not a lot of slack in that system. No one anticipated there would be enormous demand for these face masks. And I've been told from various sources that, nope, you're not going to get them. It's not possible to tool up and have these things made and in the stores until September. Once again, suggesting to me that more slack in the system is needed. People need to understand in crises like this, we have no allies, Navarro said back in 2009 during the swine flu problem. Our best friends in Australia, Great Britain, and Canada basically denied us what we needed. The bottom line, he said, is that this administration is moving as rapidly as possible in my part of the portfolio to make sure our supply chain is secure and we have what we need. Well, in the midst of an international crisis such as coronavirus, you see how popular nationalism really is, particularly after we had several weeks of jaw-dropping stories concerning what the Chinese really eat this and they eat that. No, no, they no. Yeah, but it turns out that it's true. Now, of course, in the recent past, we've been told not to make value judgments. That who are we to say that our cuisine is better than theirs? Well, I don't know. I mean, if their cuisine results in potentially catastrophic global epidemics, then maybe it is a good idea to make value judgments. Now, you've heard me complain about Disney, the Devil Mouse, on how it is swallowing all entertainment production in the United States, in the world, and how I think that's a bad idea. Well, something unusual happened in that regard today, which is that Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, he quit. He's been kicked upstairs. And this wasn't supposed to happen because, when he replaced the previous guy, this did not go all that well. It led to uncertainty. And, you might remember that just a couple of weeks ago, Bob Iger was saying that, he'd have to have a talk with Martin Scorsese because Scorsese said that Marvel films, of course, Marvel's owned by Disney, and now there's talk that Marvel is going to buy DC Comics as well. Scorsese said that Marvel films were not a film or cinema, whatever you want to call it. As he appreciated it, they were like theme parks. And, I guess Iger was going to let him know that, hey, come on. You got to stop saying things like this. I mean, you want to make movies in the future, don't you? And you do not want to get on the wrong side of Bob Iger. Now, let's see. The Rational Walk says of this is very weird on many levels, and there's got to be more to the story. Summary of weird. Bob is 14 months into a 36-month extension. He didn't do this during blow them away earnings a few weeks ago. No transition. The changeover is immediate. During coronavirus park/theatrical scare crushing their stock, random Tuesday drop comes after months of Iger's press tour. That is to say, note he has long talked about running for president, and certainly hoping that it's that over other sadder options. We already have a megalomaniacal billionaire running for president. Mini Mike. Well, maybe there's other things going on. Harvey Weinstein was convicted of rape earlier this week, and maybe there are many more scandals, coming from Disney. Maybe something big is about to erupt. Who knows? But it's very, very, very strange that Iger would quit when he has. And this points out, I suppose, how much of the world remains a mystery. How much is random and cannot be predicted? Is it possible to predict anything that is not that is surprising? Because if it were really that surprising, how could one predict it? I mean, if you look at people were shocked by the 9/11 attacks, but when Clinton had been president, there was a single-engine plane, a Piper Cub or something like that, that had flown over the White House for fun. Look and see how close I can get to the White House. We know that the so-called intelligence community was aware of the threat. So let's get the latest horror stories here from Zero Hedge. San Francisco declares state of emergency over COVID-19. That's the politically correct version of coronavirus. Germany confirms 18th case. WHO warns the rest of the world is not ready for the virus to spread. The Centers for Disease Control warns Americans should prepare for possible community spread of virus. San Francisco mayor, the amusingly named London Breed, declares state of emergency. Later, CDC says pandemic, not a question of it, but when. Brazil may have South America's first coronavirus case. Germany's total is now up to 17. Italy cases spiked to 322 with 10 deaths. Japan's Shiseido tells 8,000 employees to work from home. Larry Kudlow tries to jawbone markets higher. The Dow lost 800 points or so today. HHS Secretary Azar warns U.S. lacks stockpiles of masks. Italy hotel in lockdown after first coronavirus case in Liguria. Algeria confirms first case in Switzerland. Kuwait halts all flights to Singapore and Japan. Iran confirms 95 cases, 15 deaths, including the health minister. First case in Austria. Spain reports 7 cases in under 24 hours, including in Madrid, Canary Islands, Barcelona. Yes, Iran deputy health minister infected. Now, there's a caveat lector here. You know that in something as simple as a mass shooting, you will have all of these early reports, many or most of which turn out to be false or greatly exaggerated. With something as unusual as the coronavirus epidemic, which already looks like it's going to be a much more serious threat than SARS was, a great many of these stories are going to be exaggerated or simply wrong. But going back to my original point, one thing that the coronavirus does demonstrate, beyond any question, is that the world that we have made, the globalist world that we have made, is very much susceptible to black swans. It is not designed for there to be, as I say, any slack in the system to deal with unexpected contingencies. The assumption is that everything is going to keep going the way that it's always has, or at least has until roughly 2010. And of course, why would it be any different? It's not like anything unusual ever happens. There was a plague in the Middle Ages that came from Asia. It was called the bubonic plague, and it literally changed life as everyone knew it, as I've mentioned previously. So many people were killed that feudalism, serfdom were pretty much eliminated. And I don't like to be apocalyptic in this regard. I can say that it could be very bad, perhaps it not so bad, but it would appear to be more of a threat than climate change or extinction, as people are calling it. See, global warming didn't really go very far with people, because people said, well, it doesn't seem to be warming where I live. Oh, no, you don't understand. Weather isn't climate, you idiot. It's about climate change. Well, the climate's already changed. We know this for a fact. Yeah, well, we have a hockey stick now. So everything that you know, or you thought you know, was wrong. And a 16-year-old girl, Scandinavian, with issues, is going to terrify you all, saying that the world is coming to an end real soon now, within 11 years, apparently. And I came across this stomach-churning story from the New York Post. Conservative group hires German teen Naomi Zeipt to rival Greta Thunberg's climate views. A 19-year-old German YouTuber is being dubbed the anti-Greta. A U.S. think tank with ties to the Trump administration has tapped the 19-year-old who touts climate realism over climate alarmism to represent its views, according to the Washington Post. Naomi Zeipt versus Greta Thunberg. Whom should we trust? The Illinois-based conservative and libertarian Heartland Institute asked in a video. James Taylor, director of the Arthur Robinson Center for Climate and Environmental Policy at the Institute, called Zeipt a fantastic voice for free markets and for climate realism. During the UN climate conference in Madrid in December, Heartland described Zeipt at his forum, where Taylor described her as its star. And in January, the Institute hired her to represent its climate skepticism campaign about global warming, according to the news outlet. Thunberg, who was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year last year, has excoriated world leaders for their failure to stop carbon emissions. I want you to panic, she said at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland last year. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day, and then I want you to act. Yeah, well, someone, pity I can't remember the name, someone said on Twitter a few weeks ago, I do not take from political advice from malignant teenagers, and neither should you. But the whole world has decided that, yes, we must do whatever Greta says, even though if you thought this through or spent like 5 minutes thinking about it, you realize that if her program were to be adopted, or I don't know, Bernie Sanders' program were to be adopted, they're pretty much the same thing, it would be the end of economic life as we know it in the West. Now, I don't know, I'm an opponent of scale, and I suppose there are advantages to scaling down, but we're not looking at scaling down here. What people like Greta Thunberg are suggesting is a rapid collapse, and an uncontrolled one as well. But anyway, this German teen who looks rather cute in one of the pictures where she is wearing a fedora for some reason, a hipster, I guess. And in another picture in the post, which has a video attached, she looks rather frightening, I must say. But she doesn't like to be called the anti-Greta. It's important that we keep questioning the narrative that's out there instead of promoting it. These days, climate change science isn't really a science at all. She's not this evil opposite of Greta. She might be a really nice girl, and I would like to talk to her someday. Now, this is decadence, pure and simple. Oh, yeah, they got some, what, she's 15, 16, 17-year-old girl. And, we couldn't trot out some adults. We have to find another blonde girl, another European blonde girl. Oh, she wears a fedora. That's even better. Oh, and here she is dressed up as kind of a goth. Oh, that's even better. Because I guess that's the only thing that the kids will listen to. Well, as a rule, it is not children who make decisions in our society. So what is the science on this? Greta and her allies would have you believe that the scientific community is on board with her apocalyptic thunderings. That's not true. Here's a story from Andy May at What's Up With That. Do we really only have 12 years left to live? Well, it would be 11 years because the 12-year claim was made last year. We have uninformed celebrities and politicians telling everyone who will listen we're all going to die in a climate catastrophe in 10 to 30 years. UN General Assembly President Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, that's a lot of names, of Ecuador warned us that we are the last generation that can prevent irreparable damages to our planet. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez once said, we only have 12 years or the world is going to end. Prince Charles, there's an authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm firmly of the view that the next 18 months will decide our ability to keep climate change to survivable levels and to restore nature to the equilibrium we need for our survival. However, these absurd statements are not supported by even the most fanatical climate alarmists like Kate Marvell of NASA, Gavin Schmidt of NASA, Catherine Hayhoe of Texas Tech, or Andrea Dutton of the University of Florida. The original inspiration for these statements came from a 2018 IPCC report entitled Global Warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Even the alarmist Scientific American does not think the world is ending in 12 years. So he writes, a little over 2 years ago, I posted an essay entitled Calculating the Cost of Global Warming. It did not calculate a cost, but discussed calculations made by others. Global warming and the increasing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are not existential threats to mankind or to nature. Global warming will not go runaway. This idea has been discredited by climate change skeptics and by climate alarmists alike. So given that global warming and additional CO2 will not harm us, we are reduced to a discussion of the economic impacts and benefits, both positive and negative, of global warming and CO2. Now, this is a very long essay, which you can find at the site What's Up With That. Watts is spelled W-A-T-T-S. And it mentions something that I have seen in the climate change literature, including the hockey stick for a long time now, that supposedly the temperature of the Earth. Now, it's difficult to calculate the temperature of the Earth because it's a large place and most of it is ocean, but never mind that. That the temperature of the Earth declined between 1940 and 1970. Well, the years 1940 to 1970 saw the biggest economic expansion in the history of humanity, first with the Second World War and then with the worldwide recovery to the Second World War. Despite incessant bombing, German economic production continued to increase up until the last, 2 or 3 months of the war. So if CO2 equals global warming, how is it possible that temperature declined in roughly the years 1940 to 1970? Well, that would seem to indicate that other factors are involved. Now, we all know that carbon is man's deadliest, most eternal enemy. But many years ago, when I was a schoolboy, I was taught exactly the opposite, that carbon was a sine qua non of human existence, that it was what was called a building block of matter, that as a general rule, warm is better than cold. But we're all turned away on that. May writes, global warming and additional CO2 are benefiting humankind today and will still be a net benefit for many years to come. Someday, if the worst climate change computer projections turn out to be true, there may be a net costs. But you see that warming leads to more green. It leads to longer growing seasons. Warming is good. This is what he writes. In discussions of climate change, the rather obvious benefits of global warming and additional carbon dioxide are often ignored. Yet global warming and additional CO2 have increased the amount of land under cultivation and increased farm yields. The additional CO2 has also caused the planet to become greener as measured by total leaf area. Additional CO2 in the atmosphere causes plant leaves to have fewer stomates or breathing holes in their leaves. This causes plants to use less water and makes them more resistant to extreme temperatures and droughts. Warming increases the Earth's vegetative area, and the additional CO2 causes plants to move into areas where they previously could not survive. It also allows plants to survive at higher altitudes on mountainsides because there is more CO2 available at any given air pressure, and air pressure decreases with altitude. Well, how about that? You know, as I mentioned with regard to my country of Canada, it's very cold here. It was minus 41 in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago. Our politicians, even those who should know better, carrying on about how global warming is such a terrible thing. Well, I suppose, in theory, it might be terrible for some, but it is not terrible for Canada. Quite the opposite. This is a very long essay. I'll just read a little bit more. Before any future costs can be estimated, we must first estimate what climate will do in the future. Projecting future climate is very uncertain. Determining how much impact humans have on climate is even more uncertain. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has attempted to determine human influence. The quote suggests that there may be tipping points. They mean that human influence on the climate may tip the climate system into an unstable state, causing some sort of catastrophe, but we can rule that out, as discussed in the already cited post, Can Earth Be Compared to Venus? Basically, the large amount of water in our oceans dampens any changes in our climate due to the high heat capacity of water. Colin Goldblatt and Andrew Watson shows us that it is impossible for a planet to go runaway by simply adding CO2 to the atmosphere. The IPC phrase about catastrophic changes may be suggesting that extreme weather might increase, but we've seen no signs of that. Now, which raises a question. We have, there are the good guys, supposedly, on the subject of climate change, who say that CO2 is making the earth warmer, and this is going to be very bad for these reasons. Okay. You have the so-called skeptics who have been, who are routinely compared to Holocaust deniers, and it is suggested that they should be silenced or perhaps even arrested. And then you have the ilk of Greta Thunberg. Now, everything from the essay that I've been reading from is fairly well known, that the most acclaimed climate alarmists do not agree with the hysteria of Greta Thunberg. So why is it that the media has not been denouncing her? Well, one of the reasons is that she is a strange, compelling figure to a lot of people. But I suspect the influence of deep greens. We had the nuclear winter scare in the 1980s. Ooh, we're all going to die horribly. And interestingly, almost at exactly the same time that the nuclear winter scare disappeared because Reagan managed to negotiate successfully with Gorbachev, we get the climate change scare. It's like, okay, we need to be punished. You know, we don't believe in God anymore, but we still believe in the devil, apparently. C.S. Lewis said that that was the worst of all possible situations, and that seems to be where we are now. And for our various sins, though we don't believe in sin, but you get the point, we need to be punished. And if it's not going to be nuclear winter, then it's going to be climate change. Before I move on to the next subject, I'm wondering, you know, if coronavirus turns out to be a catastrophe, the way that many people believe, and I've heard a claim that it could lead to 600,000 deaths in Canada. Canada is a country of roughly 38 million people. Now, that would be catastrophic in all sorts of ways. If 600,000 people are killed in Canada, our hospitals are going to be overwhelmed. Our infrastructure is going to be overwhelmed. Manufacturing is going to ground to a halt. You know, we're going to be dealing with several months, half a year of basically little to no economy in the country, which would have effects lasting for many years or perhaps even decades. But people tend to turn to God in perilous times, and I'm wondering if the coronavirus might lead to a situation where preachers, pastors, ministers, and priests stop talking about non-existent problems like global warming or, you know, racism all the time, and they also talk about, you know, something that's really important, which is that you are going to die, you know, if not today or tomorrow, then in 20 years or 50 years or whatever. There's nothing you can do about it. We're all doomed to die. So, you know, maybe you should decide whether you are ready to meet your maker. The churches, pretty much all of the churches in the Western world, and not just the Western world, have not been particularly interested in what they call in theology the four last things, but maybe a genuine, unexpected catastrophe could lead to a situation where our holy men get back to the job that they are supposed to be doing. I mean, one wouldn't wish a catastrophe for that to come about, but life is full of surprises. Let's see, what else do we have going on in the chat? Hemp ethanol. In fact, industrial hemp has so many uses, it could be a zoom factor in any economy. Yes, apparently there are no end of uses to hemp. I've heard this before. I'm not really aware of the evidence of it. Matt Forney says, if you need external hard drives, flash drives, a new computer, a new smartphone, anything electronic, get it now. All of those are manufactured in China. Dawn from Beyond says, diversity, inclusion, equity equals DIE, die. Oh, someone claims Chogokin 666 that yogurt yak is good. Well, I'll just have to take your word for it. Oh, apparently they have a really cool band called The Who. Jonathan Pohl, our friend Jonathan Pohl, says Mongolian music was good even during the communist era. Well, I mean, he would know about such things. My point was merely that this xenophilia, particularly with regard to food, remains a mystery to me. You know, we were told, oh, yes, food was so boring. Oh, well, as far as I'm concerned, if you have access to French cuisine and Italian cuisine, I think that's quite enough diversity. I heard someone making Corona jokes in a government liquor store a few days ago. The clerk was giving him this look, or actually looking away, indicating, you're not supposed to joke about that. And they just kept coming. One supposed zinger after another. I guess he got this idea that this was really, really funny. And as I say, the hits just kept on coming. Adam says COVID-19 might be the solution to anthropogenic climate change. Wow. Someone says, I love how Kevin never reads the chat. Well, I'm reading it now. I have been reading the chat in the last few shows. Again, Choginkin666 says German food, best food. I am fond of it myself. There was a German restaurant in Victoria, not far from where I live. It closed a couple of years ago and was replaced by some sort of Asian place. It was done up, you know, in traditional beer hall manner. I find that sort of thing rather charming. But German food, I don't know how popular it was outside of German-speaking areas in North America, but it is certainly not hip anymore. Okay, let's talk about Donald Trump. We talk about Donald Trump a lot. One of the differences between Donald Trump and recent presidents of the United States is that Donald Trump makes news. That I've been a political reporter. I was a political reporter for many years, and okay, it's time to write your weekly stories. So, what's the government doing? The government's not doing anything interesting, but I'm afraid I'm supposed to write about it anyway. Anyway, The Guardian is alarmed because Donald Trump has lashed out at liberal Supreme Court justices and demands recusals. He's raging at Sonia Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, by all accounts, is a clever woman. From what I have read about Sonia Sotomayor, and one rather has to read through the lines, that when she first attended university, she was functionally illiterate. How such a woman could become a Supreme Court justice, I don't know. Perhaps she's a quick study, as they say. In a dissent last week, Justice Sotomayor criticized the Trump administration's frequent appeals to the Supreme Court to intervene in lower court decisions and the court's willingness to side with such requests. Shouldn't she be taking this up with the majority on the court? Also, this wouldn't be a problem if the lower courts in the United States decided that they had jurisdiction over the entire country, which of course they do not, and that's why they keep getting slapped down by SOTUS. On Twitter, responding to a segment on Fox News' The Ingraham Angle, Trump unleashed a tirade against Sotomayor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who has criticized the president in the past. That's a terrible thing to say, Trump tweeted, trying to shame some into voting her way. She never criticized Justice Ginsburg when she called me a faker. Both should recuse themselves on all Trump or Trump-related matters. While elections have consequences, a reference to his 2 Supreme Court appointments since winning the White House, both reliable conservatives, I only ask for fairness, especially when it comes to decisions made by the United States Supreme Court. At a press conference in India, Trump repeated the complaint. Now, why is Donald Trump in India? I have been complaining for years about Canadian politicians, both federal and provincial, and of all the parties now routinely campaigning for votes in India. I hope, sincerely hope, that Trump, that's not the purpose of his visit to India. Because, you know, he was at some soccer stadium with 120,000 people. You know, I can understand going to India or to any other country and meeting with the leaders of that country. But when you speak in front of over 100,000 people, this rather suggests you're looking to influence Indians in America. So he smacked down Sotomayor again. He said that what she said was highly inappropriate, and everyone agrees to that, virtually everybody. So this month, Attorney General William Barr publicly criticized Trump's tweeting on Justice Department matters and reportedly said he was considering quitting after Trump failed to heed his warning to stop. Again, my warning is that unless this is a direct quotation, just to ignore all of these stories saying that a member of Trump's cabinet or a member of his staff or someone like that said something about Trump, because such claims have been exposed as lies again and again. Sotomayor wrote, and with each successive application, of course, its cries of urgency ring increasingly hollow. Again, take this up with the majority on the court. Ginsburg said that she regretted calling Trump a faker. And she said she could not imagine what the country would be with Donald Trump as our president. This is not the sort of thing that Supreme Court justices should say. And, you know, I suspect that if a Supreme Court justice had said this about Obama, there would have been strong pressure for him to resign. But again, I don't want to play the double standards game because it's a mugs game. So the website Ace of Spades has become very interesting lately. Let's see, Judge Amy Jackson Berman just inked a book deal with Javelin in the low 7 figures for a book about constitutional law to be published in spring 2021. Yeah, this is a woman who keeps being given these top cases. And I don't really think that she is a neutral person. Let's see, resistance hanging judge declares Roger Stone jury forewoman didn't technically lie, declares that calling Trump supporters racist does not show bias. Read Stone's complaint in mocking tone. And Ace of Spades comments, she's making it extremely easy for Trump to pardon Roger Stone. There's also the other matter that it would appear that he was not being best served by his very expensive legal team, that they failed to find easily findable evidence that the woman chosen as the foreperson of the jury should not have been allowed on the jury at all because of her political bias. And they let her get away with, shall we say, misleading statements about her involvement in politics. And this is slightly off topic, but I can't resist speaking about it. Pete Buttigieg advises 9-year-old boy on how to be gay. Presidential candidate Pete Buttigieg shared an emotional moment in front of thousands of supporters Saturday when a 9-year-old boy asked for his help coming out gay. Would you help Tell the world I'm gay too. I want to be brave like you. The boy wrote on a card that was read by the moderator during Butt Judge's rally in Denver. Wow, Butt Judge responded. The crowd began chanting, "Love is love," as Zachary Rowe, spelled R-O, made his way to the stage. Zachary handed Butt Judge a bracelet he'd made. Aww. And the candidate slipped it on its wrist. I don't think you need a lot of advice from me on bravery. You seem pretty strong, Butt Judge said. It took me a long time to figure out how to tell even my best friend that I was gay, let alone to go out there and tell the world. So now we have 9-year-old gays. How would a 9-year-old boy know that he was homosexual? This is exceedingly alarming. How is it possible that this information is vouchsafed to Pete Buttigieg during a campaign rally? Who was behind this? I don't like to play the slippery slope game because it's conceding territory which has not necessarily been lost. Oh, but so we have 9-year-old gays now. We're going to have 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. They're going to be gay in the womb. How would, 9-year-olds believe all sorts of things. They might believe that they're superheroes. This is the sort of thing that 9-year-olds frequently believe. And I'm sure it still happens that they come to grief when they persuaded themselves that they can fly. And they jump out of second or even third story windows, or they jump off the roof of garages and that sort of thing. This is absolutely monstrous. But as I predicted some months ago, our elite is coming around to the position that the only good Christian is a gay Christian. And yeah, so Pete Buttigieg is the Manchurian candidate, the man from McKinsey. Oh, but he's really, really strong Episcopalian. Yeah, okay. But he's gay, and there's no conflict there, despite everything that the Bible says, and despite pretty much 2 millennia of church teaching. But never mind that. Oh, I want to say something about love is love. That's an absolute imperative. At the time that gay marriage was forced down everyone's throat, people made the objection that we're going to get polygamy next, or we're going to get polyamory next. Oh, that is outrageous. How dare you? The one does not follow from the other. Well, the transsexualism followed from the original LGB, that followed, and then trans kids followed from that. When one says that love is love, well, how can you rule out incest? How can you rule out bestiality? How can you rule out pedophilia? If it is true that love is love, then how is any one form of love any better than any other form of love? And this expression and others similar, they're Trojan horses. We're being softened up for things that are even more monstrous than what we've seen, although it would be difficult to imagine anything more monstrous than a 9-year-old gay boy or some 10-year-old called Desmond is Amazing doing his drag act at a gay bar where homosexual men throw money at him. So there's been a lot of complaints, a lot of blackpilling, that Donald Trump and his administration have not done anything about suppression of free speech by commercial entities, in particular Silicon Valley. Well, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, is a very busy man these days, and this is what he had to say last week. Today, online platforms have become essential to Americans' daily lives, often serving as the primary conduit for how we receive and share information. I'm reading from the Columbia Bugle here. Barr then discusses how, due to big text changes, Section 230 needs to be looked at. The lack of feasible alternatives is relevant in the Section 230 discussion, both for those citizens who want safer online spaces and for those whose speech has been banned or restricted by these platforms. The goal of firms is to maximize profit, while the mission of the government is to protect American citizens and society. Law enforcement cannot delegate our obligations to protect the safety of the American people purely to the judgment of profit-seeking private firms. Senator Hawley of Missouri last year introduced legislation which would remove big tech's immunity received under Section 230 unless they submit to an external audit that would prove their algorithms and content removal policies remain politically neutral. Tucker Carlson has praised Senator Hawley's plan. He said that he had proposed stripping that immunity from tech companies and treating them like everyone else unless they can maintain neutrality. So this is turning around a big ship. It's turning around an ocean liner. It's turning around one of those cruise ships, which is being quarantined now. It can't be done all at once. It has to be done carefully. And this usually takes a fair amount of time. But I think that we're going to get more acceleration, if you will, because the first 3 years of Trump's presidency were spent largely in fending off a coup d'etat by the Democrats, the media, the CIA, the Department of Justice, the FBI, and seemingly every federal agency, shadowy or not. Isn't what they say to the young gays is things get better? I believe the phrase is something, it gets better. Sorry. I think for those people who have consider themselves to be black-pilled, I think it's going to get better for them as well. Now, we hear a lot about the division between red states and blue states, but what about the division between those people in the states? The Electoral College is a process which makes it impossible for America as a whole, politically, to be overwhelmed by a relative handful of cities. And now that the progressives have finally figured out what the purpose of the Electoral College is, you're hearing more and more that no, the Electoral College needs to be dismantled because we need one person, one vote. Well, that's what you have. That's what you have in the states due to, guess what? A Supreme Court ruling. Now, for several years, I've been intrigued with a non-existent state, which is called Jefferson. I suppose because they have what's really a cool flag, which is essentially the background is green. It's a yellow circle with black print, and there's two X's, and they stand for a double cross. According to Wikipedia, the state of Jefferson is a proposed U.S. state that would span the contiguous, mostly rural area of southern Oregon and northern California, where several attempts to separate from Oregon and California, respectively, have taken place. The region on the Pacific coast is the most famous of several that have sought to adopt the name of Thomas Jefferson, third president of the United States, who sent the Lewis and Clark expedition into the Pacific Northwest in 1803. If you look at, Oregon, of course, and California are two of the most liberal states in the Union. Well, Washington as well, the whole westernmost states. But if you look at county by county maps of the 2016 presidential election, you will find out that Trump actually won a lot of counties in those states. They were rural counties, frequently with not very many people in them. But if you live in Oregon and you don't live in greater Portland, you have no say in anything that goes on. And here's a story from the Washington Times last week. You've got Oregonians seeking to cascade into Idaho, Virginians who identify as West Virginians, Illinoisans fighting to escape Chicago, Californians dreaming of starting a 51st state, and New Yorkers who think 3 states are better than 1. Separation fever is sweeping the nation as quixotic but tenacious bands of frustrated rural dwellers, suburbanites, and conservatives seek to break free from states with legislators increasingly controlled by liberal big cities and metropolitan strongholds. Oregon is controlled by the northwest portion of the state, Portland to Eugene. That's urban land, and their decisions are not really representing rural Oregon, said Mike McCarter, president of Move Oregon's Border for a Greater Ohio. They have their agenda, and they're moving forward with it, and they're not listening to us. You know, growing up, and of course, you know, you still get the American TV channels in Canada. It's had a big effect on Canadian culture. But I early on learned to distinguish those people who were reading the news, say in Seattle, those people who were not native to the region, because people who are native to the region say Seattle. People who are not tend to say things like Seattle, or instead of Oregon, Oregon. Of course, you see a similar thing in Canada, a rural suburb of Vancouver, which is increasingly not all that rural anymore. Well, the locals call it Abbotsford, whereas people who don't know about it call it Abbotsford. And I remember my grandfather saying to me that no one from, Toronto says Toronto. They say Trana. Something pretty much close to Trana. But I digress. In Virginia, the newly elected Democratic majority's progressive legislation, it's progressive, is it? On issues such as, I would think that, giving gun rights to, or guaranteeing gun rights to citizens might be considered progressive. But, he who controls the language controls the politics. Anyway, this has resulted in Vexit, or Virginia Exit, a campaign to merge right-tilting rural counties into neighboring West Virginia that organizers say has the potential to catch fire nationwide. To be honest, if this works, you've got a lot of red areas in the country that are totally dominated by a blue metropolis, said Vexit 2020 leader Rick Boyer, a former member of the Campbell County Board of Supervisors. If it works in Virginia, there's no reason it can't reshape the political map. Such campaigns can only be described as long shots. No state has split off since West Virginia was carved from Virginia in 1863, but the growing interest comes as those living outside cities wrestle with the consequences of the 1964 Supreme Court decision in Reynolds versus Sims. The ruling established the principle of one man, one vote. It's one person, one vote, effectively eliminating state legislative districts apportioned by county or geography instead of population, which hobbled the influence of smaller and rural communities. Illinois State Representative Brad Holbrook has introduced a resolution to spin off Chicago and declare it to be the 51st state, saying that downstate voices are simply not being heard because we've been forced into this democracy that concentrated power into a small geographical area of the state. I mean, I wonder if the Supreme Court had actually thought this through. There are protections in many places, including Canadian provinces and Canada generally, because you would end up in a situation where you would have one representative, looking after, an simply enormous tract of land that would be exceedingly difficult to represent in any way. I mean, you'd have to be flying from city to city to city endlessly. Whereas if you represent an urban district, you can drive the breadth of it in a few minutes. So, this is a very interesting comparison. Talking a comparison of solidarity. We have operations in 49 of 102 counties. We compare it to the way solidarity worked in Poland, where the people just decided they were done and transitioned from a communist government to a democracy without having a civil war. In New York, Divide New York State has for years championed the idea of 3 autonomous self-governing regions eliminating the need for Congress to create separate states. More ambitious is New California, which seeks to create a 51st state, and Cal-Exit, which wants to make California its own nation. In Oregon, 3 counties have agreed to place a measure on the ballot instructing local officials to begin negotiations to relocate the Oregon-Idaho border to make this county a county of Idaho. And there's a map in this story, one of the other stories that I saw, where suddenly Idaho becomes kind of huge on the map. My position, small is beautiful. It was never the intent of the founders that the city of New York, say, should completely dominate the state of New York, to give one example, or the city of Boston should completely dominate Massachusetts. The United States is supposed to be a representative democracy where there are restrictions on vox populi, but perhaps secession is the only way out. Of course, the powers that be will fight tooth and nail to prevent this from happening. Although I can see a situation where if California were divided into 3 new states, or New York State were divided into 3 new states, and the Democrats were guaranteed of winning 2 out of the 3, then they would agree to that, because it would make them much more likely to get a lock on control of the Senate. But I just imagine, living in rural Oregon, or living in rural Washington, or living, say, in the far north of California, or the northeast of California, that one must feel that one has no say whatsoever in the governance of that territory. So, oh yes, here's a very nasty story. The pedophiles, that is the United Kingdom. We had official admissions not that long ago that the police, for over a decade, covered up large-scale white slavery, trafficking in adolescent, typically 11 to 15-year-old English girls by men, Asian men, typically from Pakistan. The police knew all about this. These women, young women, were groomed and then repeatedly raped to enrich their oppressors. The police, the local authorities, they knew all about it, but they decided to keep it secret because they didn't want to be accused of racism. Now, I think that some of them kept it silent because, to be frank, they thought that these girls were getting what they deserve. That if you're going to introduce such diversity into any area, you are going to get alienation and hatred. Minorities are going to be looking to settle scores. We see it everywhere in the world. We see it throughout history. We see it in the world right now, and it looks like it can only get worse. This is a story from Kate Forrester at HuffPost. MPs who sexually abused children were protected from prosecution and their crimes covered up for decades. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, commissioned to examine whether Westminster turned a blind eye to allegations of pedophilia, ruled political institutions had failed significantly. But crucially, the inquiry found no evidence of an organized pedophile ring or that party whips had deliberately suppressed information about child sex abuse. It is clear that there have been significant failures by Westminster institutions in their dealing with and confrontation of allegations of child sexual abuse. This has included not recognizing it, turning a blind eye to it, actively shielding and protecting perpetrators, and covering up allegations of child sexual abuse. I should mention, although this isn't in the story, this was reported on by Private Eye magazine at the time, and the Daily Mail has also reported on it in recent years, that the Labour Party, up to and including people as important as Harriet Harman, took an extreme libertarian position that man-boy love should not be suppressed by the state. and that funds were provided to organizations that held this view. There was similar sentiment certainly in the Conservative Party, which was associated with notorious pedophile information exchange, and the Liberal Party. Well, I guess you had Cyril Smith, and you had Jeremy Thorpe. Jeremy Thorpe was not a pedophile. He was fond of rent boys, certainly. And of course, he was criminally charged with conspiracy to murder one of his male lovers. Allegations against the late Liberal Party MP Cyril Smith. Look this guy up. Okay, the guy, he weighed about 350 to 400 pounds. Okay. He was clearly bent. Oh yes, he has a very strong interest in youth, particularly at risk youth. Everyone knew what was going on. Allegations against him and Tory MP Peter Morrison, who later became Margaret Thatcher's parliamentary private secretary, were not investigated properly, and the Conservative Party was found to have failed to pass information on to police. In fact, Morrison, who died in 1995, was given a knighthood despite having been caught molesting a 15-year-old boy on a train at Crewe. Margaret Thatcher pressed for years and years and years that a knighthood should be given to Jimmy Savile. Jimmy Savile was at one point, I don't know, the most famous man in Britain or close to it for decades. After his death, he was revealed that he was one of the great monsters of British history, and yet he spent every Christmas with Margaret Thatcher and her husband Dennis at their country residence Chequers. He was exceedingly close to not only the Princess of Wales, but even more so to that late woman's former husband, Prince Charles. This is absolutely, absolutely appalling. Oh, yeah, they weren't aware. Smith, who before becoming an MP held a role in a youth hostel, which he claimed permitted him to carry out medical inspections, was accused of multiple incidents of sexual assault against teenage boys. Former Liberal Party leader Lord Steele, formerly David Steele, told the inquiry that because allegations against Smith had arisen before he joined the party, he saw no reason or no locus to go back to it. The ex-Lib Dem leader announced he would quit the party and retire from the Lords in the wake of its publication. Well, there's some good news. Richard Score, a specialized abuse lawyer at Slater and Gordon, representing 8 of Cyril Smith's victims, said, "What my clients would really like to hear is an honest and sincere apology that as vulnerable youngsters, Steele let them down, and a promise from those in power that lessons will be learned from this and the mistakes of the past will not be repeated." Meanwhile, Victor Montague, the former MP for South Dorset and 10th Earl of Sandwich, was let off with a caution after a 10-year-old boy alleged he had indecently assaulted him. Now, in the wake of the Jimmy scandal horror, a very serious problem arose, where it was revealed that this man's activities had been shielded. He was actually given control of a hospital. Yeah, that's right. I'm not making this up. You're very interested in in medicine and raising money for charity. Here's a hospital. We're going to let you run it. This was a wrestler and a DJ, and he gets to run a hospital because he knew the right people. But there was an enormous amount of anger, generalized anger in Britain after the details about Jimmy Savile came out. And I'm going to be talking, coming up on the book club in a month or two, talking about the book In Plain Sight about Jimmy Savile, which is one of the most shocking things that I have ever read. But people wanted revenge. And this all started when the BBC had arranged this program celebrating Jimmy Savile's life. And then people started saying, you can't possibly be serious, because we all know about Jimmy Savile. And so the dominoes started falling and all the information came out, but people wanted revenge. And so there was a witch hunt for pretty much anyone who worked at the BBC from the years, I don't know, 1960 to 2000. Now you have Rolf Harris, the Australian entertainer, being convicted based on accusations made about things that he supposedly did in the 1970s. Maybe he's guilty, maybe he isn't, but I don't really see how this could be proved one way or the other. Now, I'm not going to deny the shocking institutional abuse in the Catholic Church. I've talked about it many times. It's one of the greatest, sadnesses of my life that this happened. But we know for a fact that false accusations have become routine since that time, because it's been demonstrated that there is money in it. And this all follows from people not being dealt with as they should have been dealt with at the time. This introduces what San Francis called anarcho-tyranny. Curiously, at the end of this HuffPo report, there is a live poll. This can't be an accident. And the question is, do you think Islamophobia is a serious question in the Conservative Party? Yep, can't talk about child sexual abuse without mentioning Islamophobia, because, isn't that really the bigger problem? Now, I know many of the people, perhaps a strong majority of the people who listen to this stream, are devotees of the social media service called TikTok. God knows I am. But it appears that there's a problem with TikTok, a very serious problem. No, not child sexual grooming. I know there's allegations about that, or not the implications of its own being owned by the Chinese. That's not a problem. Why would that be a problem? Cultural appropriation. Yep. Oh, man, there we have so many grave difficulties in life today. Some of them just seem so insoluble, like cultural appropriation. Apparently this is another example of white people stealing from black people. Now, I suppose when Michael Jackson pretty much stole his whole act in terms of dancing and what he wore and the motions that he made from Bob Fosse, that wasn't cultural appropriation. That was could we call it a tribute? Yeah, let's call it a tribute. Anyway, Yahoo Lifestyle reports, when it comes to social media trends, there's hardly a kid between the ages of 14 and 24 who hasn't heard of TikTok superstars Charli D'Amelio and Addison Rae Easterling. Is that really true? That there's hardly a kid between the ages of 14 and 24 who haven't heard of these TikTok superstars? Together, they have nearly 50 million followers on TikTok alone. It becomes synonymous with viral dances like the Renegade, Holy Moly, and Gimme Some, have performed in public arenas, the most recent being the NBA All-Star Game, and have even been signed to the United Talent Agency and William Morris Endeavor, respectively, to work on launching digital content. Essence Marie and Anaya Rice, meanwhile, are two of the biggest names in their community of dancers on Dub Smash, and together have amassed nearly 2 million followers on Instagram. Still, they've been unable to amass the following of Charli and others on TikTok. That's because when it comes to viral dance videos, there seems to be a parallel universe based largely on race, in which white kids dominate on TikTok, while everyone else seems partial to a 2014 app that actually predates TikTok, Dub Smash, a short-form video sharing program where burgeoning content creators can showcase their talents, mainly in dance and comedy. I'm just thinking, previous dance crazes, I don't know, the mashed potato, the hully gully, the twist, or whatever. Are there specific names associated with them? I don't think so. I know that the twist is associated first with Hank Ballard and then with Chubby Checker. But, Hank Ballard wrote a song called The Twist, and Chubby Checker did a cover of that song, which ended up being significantly more popular. Does anyone really own a dance? Anyway, the New York Times to the rescue. This troublingly segregated backstory, or, story, you could say, began blowing up last week when the New York Times published a feature about 14-year-old Georgia native Jalalaya Harmon and her creation of the original Renegade. This coincided with a tweet from Kay Camp, the artist behind the song Lottery, by which he gave Harmon a shout out for helping with the success of the song through her viral dance. And yes, gaining recognition from the likes of Kim Kardashian and Michelle Obama, oh my, since appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres Show. While neither D'Amelio nor Easterling responded to Yahoo Lifestyle's requests for comments, yes, and they recognize that there's depreciation there, etc. Okay, it would appear that white people prefer to look at white people jumping around rather than black people jumping around, and vice versa. When it's transitioned, your name gets lost along the way, Essence 15 told Yahoo Lifestyle of her dance challenge that she's seen take off without her name attached. It's called Crash Flow, and she originated in Dub Smash before it made its way to other social media. That's understandable, she says, but at the same time, it shouldn't be that way. Y'all don't know who we are, yet y'all all been doing our stuff for so long. And there is a TikTok video here. Well, I thought, like, what is this stuff? Okay, here's the thing. It is astonishingly basic. Astonishingly basic. It's okay. It's pretty much that. A little more complicated, But, clearly the reason why it has become so popular is because it is so easy to do. If you look at the urban dancing going back to the 1980s, I guess there weren't all that many pop and lock and all this kind of stuff. That stuff was hard to do. I talked on Theater Thursday about the British movie Fish Tank, and we have this girl who lives in a council estate, 15, and she's determined to become that kind of dancer. And I don't know, she really works hard at it. She puts the effort into it. She's passionate about it. And then she's walking down this alley, and there's this black kid doing flips where, his feet are coming off the wall and he's not losing his balance. And you're thinking, yeah, that guy is really good. And this white kid is just never going to be that good. But this stuff, it's just, perhaps I overuse this word decadence. But, if this stuff were really difficult, if one could be really proud for being good at it, I could kind of imagine why these black girls are particularly put out, once again, with the caveat that generally people don't get credit for, dances. But this stuff is just so basic. It's just so simple. It's hardly worth talking about it, of course, but again, it's another cruel example of cultural appropriation, which of course only works in one direction. It doesn't work in the other direction. That story I told you about Bob Fosse and Michael Jackson, you should probably forget that you ever heard it, because if you repeat that in public, it could lead to an ugly situation, and I wouldn't want any of my listeners, any viewers, to find themselves in ugly situations based on anything they heard on this live stream. Actually, it turns out I'm a big fan of Bob Fosse. Well, not so much his choreography, but the movies that he made. Star 80, I talked about on Theater Thursday, and a movie that I perhaps like even more, All That Jazz. I will be talking about that. All That Jazz is really astonishing movie. I suppose I talked about Star 80 because it's about a young woman from Vancouver, and the movie, the first half of it anyway, is set in Vancouver, and I lived in Vancouver for most of my life, and that movie is just so astonishingly accurate about Vancouver. It's really remarkable. People note that I smoke cigarettes and that I'm not all that happy on the war on tobacco. People are forced to go outside to leave the places where they work, leave, often their apartment buildings. But it's not yet universal. Not allowed to smoke on patios, not allowed to smoke in parks increasingly. And this is clearly not a health issue because in public places, outdoors, the smoke is dissipated immediately. Of course, there's all these cars driving by emitting pollution, which we're all breathing in, but, we can't get rid of cars, apparently. Here's a story from Suffolk County, New York. CBS, is one suburban county going too far trying to legislate what residents can and cannot do in the privacy of their own homes? Hoping to be the most progressive county in the state, Suffolk County is proposing a law that would snuff out secondhand smoke in apartment complexes, condominiums, and multi-family dwellings. Smoking is already banned in many public places and near schools and office buildings, but there are no smoke-free laws for apartment buildings, condos, and two-family homes. Let me be clear, any legislation that there is a vote required that would have an impact on preventing the public or innocent people who have made a choice not to smoke from being exposed to smoke, I will support that legislation, said Suffolk legislator Dr. William Spencer. He says that secondhand smoke can permeate through cracks in walls, electrical lines, plumbing, and ventilation systems. Statistics show more than 3,000 non-smokers in New York die each year from heart disease and lung cancer caused by secondhand smoke. Well, they're bogus statistics. The World Health Organization did the most complete meta-analysis of this. They suppressed it because it showed there were no significant medical effects. And of course, in one of the biggest scandals in American scientific history, the Environmental Protection Agency rigged a study claiming that secondhand smoke was an enormous threat. 19% effect, which is statistical static. In fact, they had to cherry pick the studies that were used. They had to violate their own rules about confidence level. And this EPA study was actually struck down in court. But amusingly, people like this doctor, or people like him, are making the claim that there's something called third-hand smoke, which apparently is the most dangerous of them all. I'll give you an example. Let's say smoker or a bunch of smokers, they had a couch, and they used to sit on the couch and smoke. Well, smoke's going to get into the couch. Let's say they gave this couch or sold it to someone else. Oh my God, the couch is toxic. Now, of course, studies have been done going back to the 1970s showing that as far as secondhand smoke goes, one would have to be in a room without leaving pretty much a sealed room for up to 10 hours to get the effect of one cigarette. But this is a class conflict. People who smoke tend to be lower the socioeconomic scale, and smoking is not a pleasure appreciated by those who are our betters, except I suppose for some who might be described as bohemians. And of course, it's not enough for these people to feel superior. They must stop us from doing what we want, even, as they say, in the privacy of our own homes. Now, this is apparently is a public health argument, right? Is it? Are there health warnings against male homosexuality? Because male homosexuality is associated with many unpleasant medical consequences, and they result in a great cost to the medical system as a whole and to the people involved themselves. But it's just unthinkable that anyone could point that out. Again, I caution people, probably not a good idea to make that argument in public. It could be troublesome. There was an American animator. His name was Tex Avery. In my view, he's one of the greatest artists of the 20th century. He worked for Warner Brothers. He was famously fired by Leon Schlesinger a cartoon that he made ends with the telling of a dirty joke. I don't think that people would have understood the joke at the time. Here we go again. That's the punchline. And he introduced a lot of jokes that have been stolen. He introduced a joke in his final cartoon for Warner Brothers, which was reused in both Pee-wee's Big Adventure and in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. And it's the joke where you fall off or you're thrown off a cliff. And like there's two people like huddling, grabbing each other for safety, although how that makes it safer, that's just part of the joke. And they're screaming and screaming and screaming and screaming, and they don't hit the bottom. Then they stop. And then they start screaming again. And I think twice was enough for Leon Schlesinger. Tex Avery wanted to do it 3 times. Nope. We're going to cut that out of the cartoon. I particularly like the touch in Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, where one of them, Bill or Ted, says, dude, this is a totally deep hole. Anyway, Tex Avery moved on to MGM, and he made a lot of famous cartoons there. One of my favorites, the genre is of the world of tomorrow. And it was all about, these cartoons were made in the early 1950s, and it was all about the supposed benefits of automation in the home. And the gag is that these robot aides always turn on their human masters. We have a story here from Ars Technica. Driver stranded after connected rental car can't call home. Tech reporter from The Guardian gets stuck in the boonies by the internet things. I don't know this tech reporter from The Guardian, but if I were thinking up a generic revenge headline that would be most pleasing to me, I think tech reporter from The Guardian gets stuck in the boonies by the internet things. That would be in my top 10. Today in sharing economy struggles, writes Carrie Paul, our app-powered car rental lost cell service on the side of a mountain in rural California. Now I live here, I guess. Now I live here, I guess. She sounds like Mark from Peep Show. This is the worst thing that's ever happened to anybody. It turned into a cautionary tale about the perils of connected car and the Internet of Things. Paul had rented a car through a local car sharing service called Gig Car Share, which offers a fleet of hybrid Toyota Priuses and electric Chevrolet Bolt EVs in the Bay Area and Sacramento, with plans to spend the weekend in a more rural part of the state, about 3 hours north of Oakland. But on Sunday, she was stranded on an unpaved road. Oh, an unpaved road. When the car's telematics system lost its cell signal. Without being able to call home, the rented Prius refused to move. Adding insult to injury, Paul's cell phone was not similarly troubled by the remote location, allowing her to express her frustration, but also talk to Gig's customer service to try to get the car back in motion. At first, the company's plan was to send a tow truck to tow the Prius a few miles closer to civilization, but that would be too easy. It appears Gig's customer service unhelpfully suggested Paul and her companion spend the night sleeping in the car and trying to start the car again the next morning. Instead, after a 6-hour wait and not one but 2 tow trucks, the second of which Paul called herself, plus 20 calls to Gig, the problem was finally solved in the early hours of Monday morning. It's quite the ordeal. In fairness to Gig, on his website, the company does explain that users can order an RFID card to use to lock or unlock the car in areas of poor cell service, although that isn't entirely compatible with the ability to sign up instantly and rent a car on the spot. It now appears to be a different approach that was taken by Car2Go, now known as Share Now, the now defunct car sharing service from Daimler that filled cities like Seattle and Washington, D.C. with blue and white smart cars. Those cars were geo-fenced to particular cities and also needed cellular reception to start a trip. But they included the option to turn the car off while still keeping the rental running, therefore only requiring the key to unlock them and turn them back on. Now, I don't know that this woman, Carrie Paul, she's described as a Guardian reporter. Is she a native of England? She lists her location here as Oakland, California. Now, I'm assuming that anyone who's not a moron who lives in the United States or lives even, in the state of California and wants to go, off the grid, as it were, will realize that these are enormous places. And what, are you certain of getting cell phone signal everywhere you go? Because isn't it a kind of a cliche on TV commercials? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Oh, I've only got one bar. I need more bars. I mean, people know about this, right? Particularly someone who's a technology writer would know about this. But maybe it's not a good idea yet to turn over control of movement to machines and to algorithms. Maybe we're not quite ready for that. The last story, are bisexual men real? I was curious, as I mentioned a couple of hours ago, that this hashtag bisexual men are real was trending. I'm a little dubious about how organic and impartial Twitter hashtags are. But yeah, it was trending throughout the day. And the story was is a lot of men were upset that apparently their gender expression, whatever you want to call it, was not being taken seriously. The B is really the odd man out there. Because, it started with the lesbian and gays, or gays and lesbians. And then, okay, we'll throw the B in there. And then they added T. And things got really spicy. And then just all the others of the letters of the alphabet, including two Qs, for reasons which I've explained before, but will not explain now. And I found this story from a couple of years ago from the Daily Beast. Why Amber Rose won't date bisexual men and why she's wrong. This is by Samantha Allen from 3 years ago, and I gathered this young blonde lady specializes. Oh, yes. Let's explain about Samantha Allen. She holds a PhD in women's gender and sexuality studies from Emory University. In 2013, she received the John Money Fellowship for Scholars of Sexology from the Kinsey Institute. John Money, Johnmoney. Look him up on Google. This man was an absolute monster. But apparently they give out a fellowship in his name, and people are proud to receive that fellowship. Amber Rose is a black woman with a shaved head who is famous for reasons that I don't really remember. Model and TV star Amber Rose once told Complex, "I'm extremely open with my sexuality. I can be in love with a woman. I can be in love with a man. I definitely find beauty in everybody, whether they're heavy set, super skinny, if they're white, black, Indian, Asian, Spanish." But apparently she draws a line at bisexual guys. The revelation that Rose, herself bisexual, would not consider dating a bi man, first highlighted by Radio.com on Thursday, came toward the tail end of a new episode of a Wrapped Love Line radio show, a long-running relationship and dating advice program made famous by former host and reality TV star Dr. Drew Pinsky. She said she wouldn't do it. Personally, no judgment, wouldn't be comfortable. I just wouldn't be comfortable with it, and I don't know why. Okay, let's do a control F here for disease. Nope, doesn't come up. How about AIDS? Nope, doesn't come up. How about HIV? Doesn't come up. Those are questions that, first, this is an obvious explanation for this, But nah, even though this Dr. Hot Pants here, who wrote this story with her PhD, come on, this didn't occur to her? Or was it decided that it's best not to discuss these things? One member of the Facebook audience particularly elicited a strong reaction from the host by writing, "This is a problem with people accepting bisexuality in women and not men. And though it would be a stretch to claim that bisexual women are socially accepted, well, the story is 3 years old, and it seems like every Hollywood actress under the age of 50 now is now officially bisexual. The commenter was certainly onto something. Bisexual men are especially disliked. An October nationally representative study of social attitudes from researchers at Indiana University found that all participants' attitudes were generally more positive towards bisexual women than bisexual men, even though attitudes towards bisexual people as a whole were in the negative to neutral range. That gender difference was still statistically significant. About a generation ago, I was greatly amused to find out that there was at the time a British slang term for bisexuals, and that term was greedies. So this story attempts to tell us that they're just like everybody else, Popular media could contain some clues. Television, for one, has reinforced the notion that bisexual men are simply closeted gay guys who should automatically be disqualified from a woman's dating pool. After going on a date with a bisexual man, Carrie Bradshaw famously opined in an episode of Sex and the City, "I'm not even sure bisexuality exists. I think it's just a layover on the way to Gay Town." 30 Rock's Liz Lemon followed suit in 2009, telling a woman with a bisexual boyfriend, "There's no such thing as bisexual. That's just something they invented in the 90s to sell hair products," which is pretty funny. There's not much distance between that reaction and the layover on the way to Gay Town theory of bisexuality. It also seems to be tied to one of the stereotypes Cruz highlighted, namely that bisexual people are inherently promiscuous, or they're cheaters who are unable to be monogamous. As health researcher Sean Cahill noted in a report for the National LGBTQ Task Force, that stereotype is a myth. Most bisexuals describe themselves as monogamous in their committed relationships. And it's not like you couldn't drive a tractor trailer through that sentence. Monogamous, they describe themselves first as monogamous in their committed relationships. Well, how about in their hookups? Are they committed? Are they monogamous in their hookups? No, they wouldn't be, would they? But we know, for instance, that this sounds curious, but I suppose it isn't if you think about it. Apparently, lesbians have more children than heterosexual women. That there's a lot of women who characterize themselves as lesbian who, turns out, they sleep with a lot of guys. But what struck me looking at some of the tweets for this bisexual men are real was that these people are desperate to be identified by membership in a group. Oh, everyone's looking down at the bisexuals. No, it's not so much that. It's just that nobody really cares. Well, being bisexual is just as valid. Yeah, if you say so, pal. Is that all you got going on in your life? That's the first thing that you would want people to think about you or say about you when your name gets mentioned? That is so very sad, as Alan Partridge would say. I'm going to wrap it up for the show. I'll just mention we have some things coming up on Theater Thursday and the Book Club on February 27th. This Thursday, we're going to be talking about Maurice Pialat's Cannes Award-winning film, Under the Son of Satan, starring Gérard Depardieu. On March the 5th, Jonathan Glazer's Sexy Beast. On March the 12th, the first silent film that we have talked about, The Last Laugh by Friedrich Murnau. On March 19th, my favorite James Bond film, On Her Majesty's Secret Service from Peter Hunt in 1969. And on March 26th, a classic of noir, Orson Welles' Touch of Evil from 1958. Coming up on the book club, we have a classic of Southern Gothic on Friday, Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood. On March the 6th, we have a satire of, how would you say, Victorian strivers. It's called The Diary of a Nobody by George and Whedon Grossmith, and it is popularly acclaimed as the funniest book ever written, and it's certainly one of the funniest books I have ever read. On March 13th, we have Christopher Caldwell's much discussed The Age of Entitlement. On March the 20th, well, that week is James Bond week on the KMG Show because we are going to talk about Kingsley Amis's The James Bond Dossier. And following that, on March the 27th, we are going to be talking about Volume 2 of Stephen Kotkin's monumental biography of Stalin, subtitled Waiting for Hitler. So, did KMG just say he was bi-curious? No, I'm not falling into that trap. Jeez. How could you even say such a thing? Anyway, so that's the end of tonight's show. I would wish to thank you most sincerely for tuning in. If you like the show or parts of it, I would ask you to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you wish to donate to the show, my PayPal account is attached to the email address kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, thank you all for tuning in, and I will be back here tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 7 p.m. Pacific Time. Good night.